Yes, if you believe enough, you can have wealth and health here on earth. And I'll pray over you. And by the way, here's the offering basket that we're going to pass you. And so my parents started seeking out faith healers all across West Texas, and it was West Texas in the late '90s, and there was no shortage. And what that meant was, again, this theme of denial. There could be no acknowledgement that what was happening was he was deteriorating from cancer. It had to be called like an attack of like a spiritual attack. What happened was the literal presence of the disease was replaced by the metaphorical notion that this was nothing more than a test of our faith. And that's how it had to be solved.
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Kefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Now, just in case you're new to the show, yes, this is a podcast all about grief. We explore the expansiveness and the pervasiveness of grief in our lives. What I've learned over my 20 plus years as a social worker and the more than a decade that I've spent as a widow is that the more we lean in and hold space and bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons in our lives, well, that's where true connection and healing and belonging happens. My guest in today's episode is Kathleen Blackburn, who was the oldest of 5 children, a 12-year-old from Lubbock, Texas, whose evangelical family eschewed public education for homeschooling and wove improbable scientific theories into literal interpretations of the Bible. Then her father, a former Air Force pilot, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of just 38. And as Kathleen writes in her incredible searing memoir, Loose of Earth, it was like pouring gasoline on the Holy Spirit. Stirred by her mother, the family committed to an extreme diet and sought deliverance from equally extreme sources: a traveling tent preacher, a Malaysian holy man, a local faith healer who led services called Miracles on 34th Street. What they didn't know at the time was that their lives were entangled with a larger, less visible environmental catastrophe. Firefighting foams containing carcinogenic compounds has contaminated the drinking water of every military site where her father had worked. Commonly referred to as forever chemicals, the presence of PFAS in West Texas besieged a landscape already burdened with vanishing water, taking up residence in wells and the bloodstreams of people who lived there. In this conversation, we explore the intricate relationship between personal grief, memory, and the political dimensions of loss. We dive deep into the complexity of memory, denial, and the impact of parental beliefs on childhood experiences of loss. As a memoirist, Kathleen explores the journey of humanizing those we've lost and shares her experiences growing up in a family that prioritized faith healing over medical care for her father's cancer. She discusses the impact of her father's military background, the denial surrounding his illness, and the emotional toll it took on her as a child. The conversation also explores the environmental factors contributing to her father's health issues, particularly PFAS contamination, and how those experiences shaped her understanding of grief and memory. I can't wait for you to meet Kathleen. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm so excited to say welcome, Kathleen Blackburn, to the show.
Oh, I'm so excited and honored to be here, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners heard at the top of the show a little bit about your story, and also that we are sister publishers. I don't know how to explain that. We both are University of Texas Press published books, and we were just giving them props, by the way. Shout out to UT Press for being amazing partners. But they heard a little bit about your story, and I think can imagine that we are going to be exploring some as we do, but in this case, in your story in particular, some really important, deep and wide topics that are both uniquely personal to the grief that you experienced in your family, around death loss and around other kind of losses, but all the way zooming out to a more expansive way, both the collective experiences that we face, but also thinking about the intersections of policy and environmentalism and our own lived experiences. And so I just want to set the stage for that, and we'll see where we go today. But I think it's just as a reminder to all of us that wherever you stand on this, grief is political because we are political. We are human beings living in systems with policies that impact us, that impact our ability to grieve, that can be the causes of our losses. And so I just setting the stage of that, not politics in terms of parties, but really about like the interconnectedness of our grief. Does that feel like a fair assessment?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think politics in terms of decision makers and power relations, and kind of the context that we inhabit that are historical and social and environmental. And in those ways,
yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That I was thinking about, I love the way you put that. I was thinking about those contexts within my personal story, and realizing that these much wider contexts were informing our daily lives, and so, I'm so eager to dive into this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am as well. And one of the things you did so beautifully in the book, I think, which was it was unique, I think, to many memoirs. I have the privilege of reading so many memoirs as host of the show, is I would say, poetic and storytelling way you interweaved your own story with the larger landscape, pun and not pun intended, of, the environmental degradation that, sort of came to the cross with the experiences of your own family. So we'll dive deep into that. But of course, we're going to start where we always start, which is helping us to all unpack the grief beliefs we all hold, because we all experience grief multiple times in our lives. We all hold beliefs, whether we ever name the word grief or utter it out loud or not. We hold beliefs, and those beliefs can impact the way we walk through the world in our grief, in our life, positively, negatively, neutrally. And so my mission in all of the work that I do is just to help us make visible what they are for us. And for many of us, some of those earlier, most profound grief beliefs happen in our early childhood by the ways in which adults in our lives are modeling what grief, air quotes, should or shouldn't look like. And so I wonder if you might take us back to a early memory of loss. It doesn't have to be the first, but just a memory of loss that comes to mind when I ask you the question about what did your family teach you early on about grief and grieving?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think grief teaches us, maybe is a bit about how the memory works, which is to say, in a really nonlinear way. And it's so interesting to me that I had experienced some forms of loss before my father was diagnosed with cancer, and then, died a little over a year later.
Yeah.
But, I've been doing some writing recently, kind of post-book. And there was this memory that I was writing about that it was actually about attending a Christian rock, at scare quotes around rock, concert with a friend of mine. And in my memory, I have thought about this memory many times over the last several years. And I was absolutely positive that it occurred after he died. I went with my friend and her family. We went to see this performer that my dad had been into, and I knew he absolutely would have gone with me if he had been alive. And so I was remembering and writing about how the the auditorium that we went to was across from the football stadium where I had gone once to see a football game with my dad. And I even imagined looking at the empty seat next to me and thinking about him being there. And what I thought this memory was about with this concert was in part the kind of adolescent self when I was 14 years old, in the year right after my dad died, beginning to live out this duality that anyone who has lost a loved one experiences, which is the life that you think you're going to have, meeting the life that you
actually have.
And then I got in touch with the childhood friend that I went to this concert with via Facebook, which is, to me, Facebook for the writer.
Right.
This is the device how we find people from our past.
Exactly.
And she told me she and her family had moved away from Lubbock, which is where we went to this concert, a year before my dad was even diagnosed.
Oh my
and
goodness.
I was utterly stunned. Now I know that memory is a slippery. If grief is a sneaky bitch, memory is a slippery one.
Right. Yes.
But that told me some things. And one of the things that it told me was that even if I have had grief experiences with grief kind of before my dad was diagnosed, it was the loss of him and really his disease leading up to his loss was so formative.
Yeah.
My memory has taken memories of moments from when he was alive but not present for certain things.
Yes.
And rearranged them in the timeline of how I even remember my own life. And that continues to stun me. So now let me very briefly just answer your question. I think that that formation began. My dad had some symptoms of colorectal cancer. He thought that he was a long distance runner, an avid marathon runner, an obsessive runner, and a really fit one, and made really good time in his age group. He was 38 years old. And the symptoms kind of continued and they got worse. And so what I remember is one morning my parents went to the doctor saying that he had some stomach problems. And I was the oldest of 5 kids and left to babysit my siblings. I was 12 years old and was going to make them some pancakes. And it was these are the banal details that you remember in light of tragedy. And when my parents came home, the big thing that morning was there were no eggs, so I could not make pancakes, and everyone was complaining. And my parents walked in, and they were ashen. And my dad had just been told that he for sure had cancer, and it looked like it might be quite serious. And in that moment, the fear was palpable. I had never seen my father afraid before, and my mother also looked quite concerned. But what the words that were used in that moment were, "He's going to be fine." Yeah. And that rhetoric did not change even through the next 13 months. And so denial was what I learned about what you do with the fear and sorrow and dread that accompanies looking down the barrel of loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, first of all, thank you for, I think in 6 seasons of having this show, it's the first time somebody's really so beautifully helped us understand the complexity of memory and how important that is, especially as we navigate loss, whether it's traumatic or not, because so much of our suffering and our fear is, what do we remember, and do we remember it correctly? And the people offer, I say this all the time on the show, like Eric was our memory keeper. So when he died, it felt especially problematic because having experienced early trauma in my teens, my memory is just shot.
Yeah.
But the importance to your point is that life-changing events like that can exacerbate the way memory is really just storytelling, right?
Yes.
Like memory is not, everything, like I say this all the time, our lives are just stories.
Yes.
So, and that isn't to devalue facts on the ground of things that happened or the impact they made on you, but it's all a story. And then when we go through some tumult, some trauma, some sort of pivotal moment, I can imagine it feels like, like a deck of cards being thrown up in the air and scattering back down. And you're now reconstructing, the house to the best that you can, and in ways that maybe make life more palpable.
Yes. Yes.
Right. That maybe allow you to live in the reality of a world that has caused you so much harm. Like anyway, we're going to come back to memory, because actually one of the many passages I flagged that I wanted to read and share with the listeners, although there's too many, otherwise I just would be narrating your book for you, is about how you've used memory in a way as a tool. So there's that piece. And then there's the story that you were alluding to about how, receiving the diagnosis, the family just said, well, that's it. It's all going to be fine. It's all going to be better. Can happen in a diagnosis or even after the fact. Like, we're just not going to talk about it. And the somehow not talking about it,
yes,
is going to save us.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I love the way that you put that, there's a sentence in the book, that I wrote, and it's kind of toward the end, but I asked, where does faith turn to grief? And for my family, the way you just put, we're not going to talk about it, and maybe that will save us.
Yeah.
The denial.
Yeah.
We called it faith.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But they were completely entangled.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's such an important introduction. I want us to walk through your exquisite memoir, which really is just helping us walk through your story. But I think it's important because while that is familiar to many families, the sort of, we're not going to talk about it, we're going to sweep it under the rug. I think there was some, extraordinary, maybe for many Americans anyways, circumstances of your childhood that were the values and the backdrop that shaped the particular way that your family was, moving away from denial, or as you said, calling faith. So you grew up in Lubbock, Texas, as you said. You were home. You and your 5 siblings were homeschooled, so not as part of the school system. Your parents were evangelical, and had not necessarily grown up evangelical, right? Had grown up Catholic, or
that's right.
in
kind of casual Catholic.
More traditional casual Catholics. Yeah. If there's such a thing, right? But I name all that to say is that part of what was happening as I read the story, particularly it came to me when you first started sharing about, so you were the oldest, you had 4 other siblings, but there were 2 kind of parallel stories where we started to see where this evangelical faith for your family, and this is not, I am not making a statement about evangelical faith, this is just how I see your story, that as you told us as the narrator, really started to put your family in jeopardy, or kind of put the safety of your family in jeopardy. And that was, the first was when your mother was pregnant with Mary, with your sister Mary, and had just decided, no hospitals, no medication, I'm just Western medicine. We're going to just sort of pray our way through this pregnancy, and also believed when, was maybe going to do a, like a home birth, or have a doula, but then then thought when things started to go wrong, that was maybe the punishment of not listening to God. So
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about how you constructed that time, about your mom's, how faith impacted your mom's birth, because your sister was born premature
Right.
to the point where her life was at risk, maybe your mom's, and also was the point in your own story where really profound parentification, I would call it, came to bear. They ended up in the hospital and you were parenting your siblings at age 11.
Yes. Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot, I have a lot of siblings. I have four younger siblings, and um sometimes I think about what fiction writers would do, and if I had been writing a novel, maybe I would have written a few less siblings. There was a lot. I love them all very much, though.
Yes.
But so one thing that was really striking to me and important to me, and understanding this story, was that my father's diagnosis was not a pivot. It wasn't a hard right turn. It was it caused an acceleration in a kind of system of beliefs that my parents were already prescribing to. So exactly as you said, I kind of had to ask myself, where do we see this all, where were some signs of where this was before the diagnosis happened? So it actually started with kind of my two youngest siblings. My mom had first my brother, and she had heard about home birth with him, and it seemed like that seemed kind of interesting to her. She called the local midwife, was not impressed with the phone interview. The story went that the midwife yawned during kind of this intake over the phone, and that did it. My mom had heard enough and went back to her regular OB-GYN. But then that birth went far past the due date, and my mom was it's a complicated story, because I think most women probably have stories of doctors disregarding their
Yes.
opinions about what should be done with their bodies, and this was another case in which this doctor recommended a induction. My mom didn't want one, and he screamed and yelled at her, apparently. And her response to that was, and this will for the uninitiated who haven't read the book, tell you a lot about the character of my mom.
Yeah.
She just chose then, when she did go into labor with my brother, to have him in the bathroom of her own home with no medical assistance. And she explained to me, and at the time I was 7 years old, that all of this had happened, this kind of drama, because she had disobeyed God and not had a midwife like she was supposed to.
Yeah.
When she became pregnant with my youngest sister, Mary, she went ahead and connected with the yawning midwife. And then, despite following obeying God that time, that baby came very, very early. And it's, I've talked to OB-GYNs since then. I've had a child myself, and talked about my own family history, and apparently, what happened with Mary Catherine, my youngest sister, is something that can develop really, really quickly. So I don't know that it was necessarily the fact that she wasn't getting regular
Checkups and visits. Yeah.
But it's still, she was 39 years old. It was, there was still just really, what was happening at that point was the sense that you are the expert of your own life, including not just kind of philosophically, but literally the medical experts, the educational experts. My parents were really divesting at a micro level from all institutions of education, medical institutions, and so on. And they were claiming that they knew better than really any other expert for their own children. And while Mary Catherine was in the hospital, in the NICU unit for 2 weeks, my parents were up there daily together. And I became the full-time babysitter at 11 years old of my three
Yeah.
younger siblings.
Yeah.
And it was an incredibly stressful time.
I'm sure.
So yeah,
Challenge.
it's hard to believe now. Yeah, I mean, and
Right.
maybe there would be families, probably,
I mean, in the 70s and 80s, I do think we were a little more, latchkey, but still,
Yes.
when I read that, a couple things came to me. Again, I think about past guests I've had and all the clients I've had and I don't know if you would even name it this way, but in a way, the precariousness of your sister's birth and the parenting of your siblings so early on as one of many things that happened feels to me a little bit like a loss of childhood.
Yes.
And a loss of innocence. And I think that's some of the losses that are the backdrop losses that we don't really come to reckon with until maybe later in life, maybe until we have our own children, and recognizing the ways in which we didn't get to be the kinds of children and be kids as long as maybe we had wished to. And so, yeah, I want to touch on that. But do you mind if there's a passage based on what you just shared that I think is so powerful, because you were talking about this thing of your parents retreating so far sort of from the world that they sort of succumbed to their own expertise, which meant they, which one can understand when I've been through medical trauma, when you've had a doctor yell at you and be incorrect and tell you things, it's very tempting to want to retreat from a world that can be harmful. And yet you offer these words about how you saw that your parents, maybe overly corrected belief in themselves to be part of like a harbinger for some things to come. You said, perhaps if nothing that came later, my father's diagnosis and its fallout had ever occurred, this memory of my mother's fourth pregnancy would not have seared itself into my mind with strange foreboding. She believed in the superiority of her own mind to almost everyone else's, but she was also responding to the historic and ongoing insidious ways in which women's autonomy concerning their own health is routinely dismissed or denied. The affront she was responding to was real, but her response also chills me now as I look back. When I try to make sense of my childhood, I see this breach between my mother and her physician as a turning point, marking a clear moment in which whatever trust she had in medical institutions dissolved. With one hand, I wish to reach back into the past and comfort her, and with another to take hold of her shoulders tightly, angrily, and say, you need to listen to someone besides yourself. I want to turn to my father and say, don't let her do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this thing that happens when we can look back to the conversation of memory, of like how we see points in time that seemed so maybe nothing, and we don't understand the trajectory that those pivots, they might be words or experiences, can have, and yet we can draw back. What did it feel like even just to hear that, or when you were writing that, to see the thread of that carrying forward? When we come back, Kathleen explores the role of memory in constructing, reconstructing, and also deconstructing what she knew as a child, what she knows now, and how that helps her hold the unresolved contradictions, including the anger over her mother's behavior, and at the same time, the deep compassion for the pain she too was enduring. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Kefauver. I wonder if you're looking for more grief resources or access to practices and tools that will help this journey of grief suck less. Or maybe you're just wanting to find more ways to connect with me and my work off the air. If that's the case, I've got just the thing for you. Occasionally, I drop into your inbox with my not-so-regular newsletter to share a bit of wisdom I think you might want to know about. It might be an essay about a topic I've been exploring lately, like the healing power of beauty, wonder, and awe in the wake of loss. Sometimes it's a journal prompt or a guided meditation that will help ease your suffering. Other times it includes news about events I'm hosting or participating in that I think you might like. I often invite you to write me a personal note answering a question I have about how you're moving through grief too. So, if that sounds like a free resource you'd like to have, I got you covered. Just head to lisakiefover.com/newsletter to sign up. Although I love being able to reach and support thousands of people each week through this show, my passion is working directly with people navigating grief. A few times a year, I have openings for a 6-session package of individual grief support that is ideal for newly grieving individuals facing all kinds of loss that could be death, but also includes illness, divorce, endings, major life transitions, and more. Or perhaps you're an individual further down the road who's looking for specialized grief care as a supplement to other therapeutic supports. Over our time together, you'll feel held and cared for, have a chance to tap inward to discover your existing skills, discover some of the barriers or shoulds that might be getting in your way. We'll be able to help you cultivate a mindfulness practice essential for easing suffering, identify your emerging needs as a griever, and begin to build the community of support you'll need as you continue on your journey. One client recently shared about our work together. Lisa provides practical advice and insights that apply to the daily challenges that grief presents, but with a heavy dose of self-care and spiritual awareness that provides support when I find myself at my darkest. The combination of real quantitative suggestions and exercises coupled with the spiritual self-care reminders is extraordinarily helpful for me. To learn more and reserve your spot today, after the show, visit lisakiefover.com/support.
You know, something that is so interesting to me about looking back, I totally agree. Are able to make meaning.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, in ways that, we just couldn't at the time, especially when you're writing about childhood.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that was really interesting to me while writing this book wasn't just what do I understand now that I didn't understand then?
Yeah.
But also, what did I understand then that some part of me struggles to access and know now? And that always led for me to a more interesting and more complicated answer than just here's what I know now.
Yeah.
That I didn't know then. And that if I had known, maybe it would have turned out better.
Yeah.
It was, and so always it would lead more towards unresolved contradiction, and so that with the one hand wanting to reach back and comfort her, because I think what she was going through was real. And that a lot of women can relate, someone introduced me to a woman who, especially in the realm of motherhood, has, or in her own health, has not had some, patriarchal figure try to take her autonomy from her. So I just really get that. I, as a child, I didn't have the language or framework for it, but I absolutely had so much sympathy for my mother, which is probably connected also to this kind of early, parentalizing thing that was going on. And then this undeniable frustration and like I say, anger. A lot of people ask me when I talk about this or give a reading, how did you get over your anger so that you could write this? And I just tell them I didn't. Right. But what I was able to do was complicate it and lay multiple truths next to one another.
I think that's so important what you just said there. It's a theme we talk about often, but I think to your point, I think we push people to have neat and happy endings and resolved clarity. And that's part of the harm that we all befall, that we think we have to have one with the other. And to say to you, which again, probably came from a good place, but to many of us, yeah, how can you write about this if you're still angry? It's like, I can be both angry and have compassion.
Yes.
Like, an anger is really about the injustice that happened to us. And it's felt very much like you could also hold deep compassion for the complexity of both of your parents, by the way. Your dad, you describe as, using some corporal punishment and some, like, they were making some choices that you would not make now. And there's probably some anger and some hurt. And
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And where did they come from? How did their parents parent them? What was the time they were living in? Like, you can see the context and the complexity, as you said.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting with my mom. What I had access to in those early drafts, and then it was kind of more of like the harsher side of her, the more extreme side of her, the side of her that comes that she puts forward as like very certain and very authoritative. And then the side of my dad that I had quick and easy access to was actually like the more gentle side of him.
Yeah, you sort of talk about running with him, and you were his pal, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And it was through it was really through what I knew the demand of the storytelling would ask of me, which was to complicate them as characters.
Yeah.
And write toward their contradictions. It's so interesting. I've never had anyone quite put it like this to me, but I'm really, with my mom, I had to move toward the things that contradicted that harshness. And with my dad, I had to be really honest about, well, where were those moments that actually contradict this golden boy thing?
Yes.
Which
is particularly challenging because he died.
Yes.
And the minute somebody dies, we have this sort of pedestalization that can happen.
Absolutely.
So I can imagine that was even more of a challenge in a way to pull into the complexity of who he was in your life.
It was, and it was also something I was so hungry for, because I started writing this book. He'd been gone 19 years when I started writing it. He was completely a myth at that point.
Yeah.
And I was an adult, and I wanted to know who was the human that was my father. And, I back to another Facebook story. I found his, old high school classmates and interviewed them. And I was unsuccessful, but I wanted to find someone who didn't like him, because maybe I did, people are so generous. Maybe I did find some people who didn't like him. They weren't going to tell me,
Right.
I wanted the textured, flawed version of the man that I wish were still in my life. This caricature of an angel, by the time I was in my 30s, was useless to me. So yes, it took a lot of work.
Yeah.
And some of it was really uncomfortable, but I was so hungry for that at that point.
And do you feel like, if a listener is listening, whether they're going to write a memoir or not, which we don't all need to do that, what do you think that allowed you, or what did that allow you to do or be in relationship with your dad in a different way, or in your grief over your dad in a different way? Now that you did do that work of kind of pulling him into a more fully fleshed human story, does that shift the way you can be carrying him forward with you? Or
Absolutely. It feels scary. I guess I would say that to listeners, but it is, it's like the way horror films work. It's only scary as long as the monster stays off camera. As soon as you see it, the thrills are over. You're fine. You realize you're going to survive it and be fine. No, it was, in the 19 years, between his death and when I wrote this memoir, he felt more distant. than I
Mm-hmm.
worked on this book for 6 years, and he felt closer in those 6 years than the 19 years prior.
Mm.
Um, and oh my gosh, just I learned he surprised. Here's what I would say:
Yeah.
he surprised me.
Yeah.
Gone 25 years,
Yeah.
over 25
Yeah.
years, and what I learned about him, um, surprised me. And isn't that what a gift? Because that's what
Right.
we
Yeah.
miss when we lose someone, is
Yes.
the ways that they surprise us and evolve, and we think that's over.
Yeah.
And
That's a really powerful perspective to think about that. And also that they go from being this mythical, fictional character to a much more very human, whole character, which is so much easier to hold in relationship to our view to ourselves, because we're very flawed, messy humans. We don't get to be the fictionalized. And so when they can be more like us, I think in a way, I can imagine that feels
yes, yes. And then I was
easier
allowed
to
to
hold
feel
close.
different things about him than just grief.
Yes.
I could
Yeah.
feel a whole range of emotions.
Okay. Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
appreciate that so much. And boy, it has me thinking about my daughter's turning 21 this next month.
Yeah.
And her dad, my husband's been gone for 13 years. And she
Mm.
said a version of those words before, like, wasn't like, tell me the things that he didn't do well, because he was an annoying
Yes.
person who did a lot of things well,
Yes,
love him. But,
yes.
and sort of like, how do we fully flesh out the humanness? Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking us on that tangent. Whenever I
Yeah.
interview a memoirist, I ask the same question of Ronit Plank. I don't know if you've read her book when
Yes,
she
and
comes
I
back.
loved your interview of her.
She is amazing, but I think she had to do some similar things. Like, how did she humanize her mother and maybe demonize her father, or vice versa? Like, how did she find and how cathartic in a way that was for her. So I appreciate that. But back to sort of setting the stage. So the sort of, I'm trying to be sensitive and careful here, but I would say the blind faith, or the sort of
Oh yeah.
the evangelical faith that you started to see show up in your mom's pregnancy with your sister, who, though was in the NICU for a while, was able to come home and,
Yes.
be well, showed up again when your father and your mother came home and, sort of ashen face said to you,
Yes.
it's cancer, but, ta-da, it's going to be fine. And I think that's the point in the story where you say, again, with memory, which you're not sure how the timing of it, that instead of going, to the Mayo Clinic, they went to a revival tent.
Yes. Yes. They started seeking
Yeah.
her out. So they were told at the time that it was what we would today call late stage.
Yeah.
Late stage cancer. It had spread from his colon to 15 spots on his liver. It was very advanced, dangerously advanced. And instead of seeking other kinds of opinions or kind of engaging in a medical treatment plan, and my dad was a commercial pilot. They had great medical insurance. There was
He had been in the military. I remember you saying you were born in Guam, I think.
That's right. I was born in
that's your claim to fame. Yeah.
Yes.
But so he had been a professional. He had insurance. He'd also been, I think that's an important context too, meaning he'd been out in the world, right?
Yes.
He'd seen the world.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about some of the exposure and maybe how the cancer came too. But he was of the world. He had seen the world. He had the financial means. And yet, instead of seeking medical care,
instead of that, my parents, these were the early days of the internet, and certainly what's called faith healing, had been around before the internet. But this notion that you can be your own expert, really, you sort of got like serious, like fire engine attached to it with everyone's ability to do dial up. And so my parents, what doctors had said was there's a possibility that a chemotherapy radiation treatment combo could slow down the cancer.
Yeah.
They weren't using the language of cure.
Right.
And that's what my parents wanted. And the folks who were saying cure were some people who were writing like kind of homeopathic kinds of narratives
Yes.
about extreme dieting, and traveling preachers who claim to have the so-called gift of healing. Some people might recognize this as like what's called prosperity gospel, but basically what
Yes.
it is it's just this idea that if you have enough faith
Yes.
and you basically claim in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, it's kind of like in more like new age kind of circles,
Yeah.
that it's like manifesting.
I was just going to say, like, and if you don't, you just didn't believe enough, which you do talk about as a child talk about a harmful
Yes.
thing to lay down on a young person. Cause you talk about like, maybe I'm not believing enough and this is what's happening. But so they're looking for the word cure, and the only places it's matching is sort of a way out there alternative diet and, traveling preachers who are going to heal you as long as you believe you.
Yes. If you believe enough, you can have wealth and health here on earth. And I'll pray over you. And by the way, here's the offering basket.
Here's the plate. Yeah.
And so my parents started seeking out faith healers all across West Texas, and it was West Texas in the late 90s, and there was no shortage.
Yes.
So it was, and what that meant was, again, this theme of denial. There could be no acknowledgement that what was happening was he was deteriorating from cancer. It had to be called like an attack of like a spiritual attack. So what happened was the literal presence of the disease was replaced by the metaphorical notion that this was nothing more than a test of our faith. And that's how it had to be solved, was through adamant belief that he would be healed miraculously with a little support from a lot of carrot juice and like clean eating.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that it was everybody in the family's job to believe God will save us.
Yes.
And looking back, you touched on a bit in a little book, but looking back, what does that do to an 11-year-old who maybe doesn't have faith? Because, how might you at 11?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would not have known to put it this way, but I absolutely believe that it came down to me.
Yeah.
In the same way that taking care of my siblings had come down to me.
And if you didn't see improvement, then it must be somehow, because also when we're 11, we're completely self-centered, as we are.
Yes.
And so we think that everything good that happens is because of us, but we also think everything that bad that happens is because of us too. And I can imagine as you're watching your dad deteriorate, which you described he did very much.
Yeah.
Just somehow, even though I didn't say it out loud, just somehow am I not believing enough?
Exactly. That's absolutely what was happening on a fairly unconscious level. And another thing that was happening that was really, I didn't fully realize until I was writing this book, was a total separation of what I was experiencing physically and instinctually understanding, and kind of this willpower that I had, which is to say, like, I think, the animal part of my body, I could see, hear, smell, pick up on all the signs.
I'm scared. This is wrong. There is something serious. There is disease happening.
Exactly.
But then but you had to probably disassociate from your body, because what everybody was demanding of you, your parents include, was, being from your head, faith, believe. When we come back, Kathleen shares how in the writing of her memoir, Loose of Earth, she came to realize how dissociated she was from her physical body for so much of her childhood, and how it took, in some ways, an act of imagination to discover what the younger version of herself was experiencing. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Kefauver. Since you're listening to this show, you know that navigating the messy reality of grief in a world obsessed with top 10 lists and productivity, can feel lonely and confusing. That's why in my new book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss, I created a safe place to be inside the messiness of it all. I've been told recently that it feels like your wise best friend offering you a comprehensive and compassionate guide to navigating loss. I share personal and professional wisdom alongside the lessons I've learned from clinicians, authors, poets, and friends. In place of rigid instructions and must-do checklists, this book invites reflections. It encourages self-compassion and explores the therapeutic power of humor with, yes, just a judicious use of profanity. One reader recently shared this. After finding Lisa's podcast of the same name, I was more than thrilled to at last have a guidebook that delves deep into all types of loss and just how all the compounded losses truly need to be honored and cared for just as we care for ourselves. I've already given this book to a friend that lost her pet, my bestie going through a divorce, and another dear friend who just lost his wife also. I love Lisa's wit and humor with her personal story of losing her husband, Eric, and I found myself shaking my head, yes, me too, on so many occasions while poring through the pages. Thank you so much, reader. Now, you can pick up your copy at your favorite independent bookstore, online bookseller, or even on the next trip you take, as it's in more than 50 airport bookstores across the country. I've linked it in the show notes, too, for today's episode. Oh, and if you like listening instead of reading, I narrated the book, too, so you can head to Audible or wherever you get your audiobooks. And as several book tour attendees shared, take me on your next walk with you.
Yes. So there was, in early versions of this, when I would send out like a kind of standalone chapter, sometimes I would get feedback from editors that would say the story is really compelling, but where's like the young Kathleen? We can't really like see her or feel her and that kind of thing. And I realized like, I was really dissociated from my physical self at that time. I had to totally ignore. So it took a lot of not just memory work, but just imaginative work to say,
Yeah.
It's like, well, what was I probably physically feeling?
Yeah.
Because
yeah. And maybe some somatic work. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and just to name this, for our listeners who've experienced any kind of, whether it's a parent or somebody you love who's ill as a child, when you were a child, or some other kind of trauma, like when you say I had to really leave my body, I just want to name for all of us, this is not about a physical threat from somebody. Does not require a physical threat to your body for you in a survival way to leave your body, because what was at risk and what was at stake was the love and attention of your parents. Because if you are not, I mean that in that little sense, like when we're young, we need to feel belonging and connection and safety. And if the party line, is like, we all have to believe God will save us, and if we don't, then we are the cause of it, turning out wrong, then we have to disassociate from what we know when our body is telling us, this doesn't feel right or seem right, because what was at stake for young Kathleen was belonging and connection.
Yeah.
Does that ring true? Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the way that you put that, because what I think I unconsciously thought, or semi-consciously thought, was it was my father's life, but on a more primal level.
Yeah,
absolutely, love and belonging.
I mean, I think both of those things can be true too, right? Is like, and I have this instinct, and also, by the way, I have this instinct, but if I don't join the party line, like there's my survival here, but also they're adults and maybe they know better, so I better deny the parts of me that might be telling me something that is instinctual in favor of, well, these are the people, like we can't believe our parents are flawed, because it puts us at existential risk to ourselves in a way.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The consequences of that knowledge at too young an age
is, yes. I mean, that's what teenage and young adulthood is for. And all of us who are parents of teenagers and young adulthood know that our parents see us, I mean, our children see us as completely flawed and having nothing of use, but that's okay. That's a conversation for another day. Um, so that you just take us a little bit through then. There you are dissociated. There your family is eating clean, keeping people out of, like, you sort of believe like the house was a safe place. Of your mom had, water systems going on. But your dad was deteriorating, needless to say, and was coming to pass. Tell us a little bit, because part of how you stretch this out over the time of the memoir, of the story, because you also start to help us understand, back to where we started today, is the context under which you understood maybe your dad's cancer and the environmental landscape, as it were.
Yes.
That was, I presume, that was an adult reflection looking back, but why was it important to come to understand, just for our listeners? So PFAS are these, chemicals that were starting to be used, and all kinds of things that were good, meaning putting out forest fires and other things. Yes. But you came to understand, apparently at some point, that maybe there was a connection and exposure, not just to your dad, but to, the community around you.
Yes. Yes.
Why was it important to pursue that for your own understanding and context? And then why weave it in the story?
Oh, that's such a good question. So when I started writing the book, I had no idea about the PFAS contamination at the sites where he had worked or lived. It was only through talking to the people he'd gone to high school with. And one of them, she, everyone had lost touch. But by the time I was talking to her, not only had my father died, but his little brother had died, his parents had died, and everyone in his immediate family, all his siblings, his parents, they had all had cancer. And some of them have survived cancer, but everyone has had cancer. And when I told this old high school friend of his, she said to me, well, have you looked into this PFAS issue at military bases? And I had no idea what she was talking about.
Yeah.
But as soon as I got off the phone with her, I Googled military sites, PFAS, Texas, and the first article that came up was a picture, not just of any Air Force base in Texas, but Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, which is in the first chapter of the book, where my dad and I go get our haircut. And I just started weeping, because that was our backyard. And I thought, what is this thing that has been, that she's talking about, that's actually right there? It was really important to me, in part because, it was, it appeared to be part of the story.
Yeah.
So I learned through my research, I learned things that I could say with certainty, and I learned a whole lot that I couldn't say with certainty.
Yeah.
So basically what I learned with certainty was that at every Air Force site where my dad had lived as a child, because he was the daughter of Air Force colonel, and then where he had lived and worked as a military service person himself, had been contaminated with the drinking water had been contaminated with PFAS from firefighting foams.
Yeah.
And it's possible.
They basically got into groundwater after they were expelled.
Yes, exactly. And at some of these sites, so in this past spring, and I promise not to stay technical for too long.
No, you're fine, please. I think it's important.
Just to kind of give a sense of the scale.
Yeah.
This past spring, the EPA passed some regulation for tap drinking water that would limit, for a few different PFAS compounds, to like 4 parts per trillion.
Yeah.
And in some of these military sites where my dad lived and worked, it's like at 135,000 parts per trillion in the drinking water. So that, so what I cannot say with certainty is that absolutely gave my father cancer.
But we know the exposure put him at disproportionate risk at the very least.
They are carcinogenic.
Yeah.
And there's also, it's true that Blackburns are also genetically predisposed. I mean,
Yes.
but if you're genetically predisposed and then you're
Well,
smoking a pack
epigenetics.
every day,
Yes.
they,
Yeah.
so, but another reason that it became so important to me to include that context, so there's two things that really strike me. One is this notion that thought my family was so isolated in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
pulled away from public schools,
School
pulled
system,
away,
medical systems.
yeah,
I mean, yeah.
but you can't pull away from your ecosystem. You cannot pull away from the shared
Ooh.
water that we all drink. You can't pull away from being a biological body.
Yeah.
And that is a collective experience, despite what we here in America like to think about our individuality and our narratives of like excellence and ability to overcome anything.
Right.
You cannot overcome the fact that we live in ecosystem. So
Yes.
that was really important. And another thing that was really important to me was that as extreme as the choices that my parents made were, um, when you look at the larger context,
Okay.
I'm not saying were there better choices. I have no idea. I think there were probably some different choices to be made.
Yeah.
Yet I do wonder how much agency do we have when we don't get to choose what we're exposed to and what's in our
Yeah.
world. And
Yeah.
so I thought that context was important, that it kind of, also had to made me stop and think,
Yeah.
how many
Yeah.
choices did they really, really have?
Yeah. And then given the fact that we all are navigating in places where we don't have some choice, meaning we are biological creatures, part of an
Yes.
ecosystem,
Yeah.
and do have some choice, then how does that shape then the effort or the curiosity we have about the choices we do have?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it really, for me, it blew the story wide open,
Yeah.
wide open. It never made sense. It just never made sense that these two college educated people made the choices that they did. And I'm not saying, oh, PFAS explains it all, but it
Yeah.
does give this broader context of like, well, what do you do when you live in a place, even if you don't know that this is what has happened to you,
Yeah.
where you can't even trust your own glass of water? And for my parents, they went to the traveling evangelist tent,
Yeah. Yeah.
ultimately.
Well, no, I appreciate that context. And there's another passage in the book that you talk about sort of the importance of memory and also reflecting back on kind of the choices that your parents made. I want to spend a little maybe close there, but before we do, I want you to help take us through to you know with your father passing,
Mm.
what did or didn't shift about the grief beliefs that you held in your family about the holding on to, if we just believe enough in God, we will be saved? How did that impact the memory keeping and the storytelling and kind of the things that we think about in the wake of loss? How might you help us understand what happened there in your family?
Yeah, I might answer this a couple different ways, and I'll try to be direct. Because it's so interesting to me, and I've only really come to understand this more deeply, kind of having written the book,
Yeah. Yeah.
that because there was so much denial, but we called it faith, and
Yes.
for us it was if faith can be just a sheer act of will. um,
Yes. Yeah.
um, it's after he died. For many years, everyone in my immediate family, my younger siblings, myself, my mom, and my mom is still
Yeah.
quite religious. None of my siblings are, and I am not either
Yeah.
at this point. But for a while, we continued in the same faith.
Yeah.
which one would think, how did you do that? And I'm still kind of exploring how we did it. It was what I'm writing now, but what I think it was that it's really shocking to me now to understand that that early stage of grief of his loss,
Yeah.
it was, I'm actually, this may be a little, this may not be totally kosher, but I actually just want to share a very brief passage of something I wrote.
Yes. Please.
So I had a wonderful writing teacher give me when I was an undergraduate, when I was in my early 20s, Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Things.
Oh, one of the best books ever written, period.
And I was just meditating on this, and it answers your question, I think.
Yeah.
And I read how Didion left her husband's shoes out for weeks after he died. I was waiting for John to come home, she wrote. She was talking about the suspension of disbelief when you lose a loved one. Yeah. I was struck then by how my faith in Christ's resurrection had at first been replaced by a refusal to believe that my father had died, and how like faith it felt, the first blow of grief. I didn't notice for years that one had replaced the other. So what I am saying is, like, when my dad first died, there was a kind of brief period, just like Didion describes, of like, you can't possibly be born.
Yeah.
And that was a transition into the denial, the shock of grief. But to me, it just felt like faith. That's what faith had always felt like, was that kind of denial. I think your question was also a little bit connected to what I did write about in this book, which was kind of walking through those final days of his life, which are included in the book. And one thing I guess I just want to share is that in writing about it for the memoir, Loose of Earth, that memory had always been only a trauma, only the worst night of my life. And it was in reading other narratives of people either who had cancer and were preparing for their death, with awareness, or people who had lost loved ones to degenerative disease, that I began to understand that night differently. And I write about how my aunt, my dad's sister, was there, and how when she is next to him when he dies, and he's experiencing breath hunger, what a lot of us will know as breath hunger. And she tells him, and he was a runner, as we've said in this interview, she helps him to imagine and to picture that he was running. And it was only through writing this book that I realized and through reading these other narratives, that I realized what a gift she had given him, and how absolutely beautiful that was. Yeah. And so again, it's this other, we talked about this, but how you put you complexify, these memories you carry around.
Yeah. And how that can be a gift, and it's not sugarcoating or whitewashing. It's the contextualization that helps us, bear the unbearable in a way, or maybe find beauty in even our darkest moments.
Yes. So it was, it did help me to, tell a fuller story, I think.
Yeah. Well, as we close, I'd love to read this last passage. And of course, it's not your last passage in the book, but a passage that resonates to me about what we've just been talking about how you've used memory and why that's so important. And also, for those who are watching online, this is Loose of Earth, this beautiful book and memoir out currently in hardcover. But you said these words that so many, if the book is tagged and flagged everywhere, but this one just struck me about the importance of your use of memory and understanding what had happened so long ago. You said, Our house was supposed to be a refuge, fortified at each doorway against sickness and spiritual attack, but it has become a sick bay caving in on itself, a compression chamber from which we feel we must flee. My siblings are too young to run away. Dad cannot move. Mom leaves in the van, and when I cannot go with her, I watch it disappear down the street. Dad departs by way of his mind, traveling to other realms, practicing his passage from this place to the next. And I begin to escape, as I will in years to come, through memory. I return to the mornings when, in the cool dark, my father woke me. I am lifted from the present and returned to the highway flanked by cotton fields, where I used to join my father on my bike before anyone else in the world, it seemed, was awake.
Yeah.
Ooh, that made me...
You know,
the use of memory to unflatten,
yes.
and to expand.
You know, like you said, memory is a storyteller. And for me, it's been a narrator for quite a long time. It's interesting about that moment is that the scene that comes there was one of the earliest things I wrote for this book. And it took me a really long time to know where it would go. A really, really long time. I finally found that.
Found that place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so beautiful, Kathleen. This whole book is, as I said, I think at the top of the show, it's just such a unique memoir in that, of course, there's the vulnerability of your story, the complexity of your unique experiences with the environmental exposure, the evangelicalism, this landscape of West Texas, and all of those things. And yet also the way in which you help, by modeling, you help us understand how meaningful it is to expand our memory, to put context and complexity to the people in our lives, to the experiences in our lives in ways that might serve us. Because if it's all a story, then what is the narration, or what is the story we're telling that allows us to both carry them forward and also live a meaningful life? And I think you offered us that in this memoir.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. And I just have to say, I was, and listening to your podcast and reading your wonderful work, I just thought, one shouldn't get too caught up in the what ifs of life, but the work you're doing is so beautiful and profound. It's helping so many people. And, just the, I'm glad to have encountered it when I did. But I just was thinking, wow, this is exactly what my siblings and I have needed for a really long time. So thank you, for this incredible work that you're doing. I honestly am not sure how you do it. But you're a Wonder Woman, and I'm just so grateful. And I know I'm one of just countless others.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm working on at 53 receiving compliments. So I'll just say thank you so much for that. And as I hope you experienced today, in part, I do it because I have learned along the course of my life, through everything I've navigated and through the opportunity to serve other people over time, that the stories we tell matter. They matter to us and they matter to other people. So thank you so much for telling your story and for being a part of our show. Thanks for joining us on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch.
I've loved it. Thank you so much for having me.
Friends, I got to share that I found Kathleen's memoir, Loose of Earth, to be extraordinary. It was part poetry, part reflection, and frankly, a masterclass in storytelling. And I found our conversation today to be the same, and I hope you did too. You can learn more about Kathleen and pick up a copy of her memoir by visiting her website, KathleenBlackburn.com. I'll drop a link in the show notes for today's episode as well. Now, I got to give a special shout out to our mutual publisher, University of Texas Press, for introducing the two of us. And remember, if you loved the conversation today, if you learned something from it, I always ask you to do one or two or maybe three things. First, share the episode with someone you think might need it too. Two, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen or watch so you don't miss the next episode when it drops. And three, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review. It really helps this show get out to the grievers who might need it most. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.